Hi, and this week's question is from Daniel. Daniel asks, how do I handle big amount of data? Like in a poll of what party one would vote for, or what brand of cheese one would prefer. For example, you could have 6 to 10 different choices, and you can choose one from each grade, ranking them from 1 to 5. Daniel also suggests things about tables and pivot tables. So let's have a look and see how you would do handling big amounts of data. Now, there are 2 ways of handling big amounts of data, and in this video I'm going to have a look at how a database would do it if you are entering data into a database as opposed to extracting data out of it. So you'd have a lot of things like your name and maybe the date and lots of things that could identify that very specific item. And then you would have the name of the cheese, for example, and you would have their preference, so the ranking. Now I'm going to convert this into a table. I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to press Ctrl and L. You can also press Ctrl and T for table if you want. Get my table as headers. Okay. So this gives me a table that I can resize and make longer, shorter, have total rows and so forth. Right, now I need some sample data. So I'm not going to fill in name and date, but I'm going to have name of cheese, the name of the cheese being from 1 to 10, I think that's the suggestion, and then a rank. So first of all, a name of a cheese. Okay, well, I'm going to say cheese number and give me a rand between, a number between 1 and 10. So that gives me a cheese number 3. And then I'm going to assess the rank. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that everybody has got these 5 different cheeses. So they've all ranked 10 cheeses and ranked 5 of them. So that'll be the sum of the one above and add 1. But I don't want it to go above 5. So I'm going to add a modulus around it. So what's that going to do? Well, it's going to go D1 divided by 5, and I want the remainder of that. So the modulus of 4,5 is, 4 divided by 5 is 0, remainder 4, so the answer will be 4. If it's 5, then the 5 divided by 5 is 1, remainder 0, so the answer is 1. And I'm just going to put a value around that for the very first one. For the very first one, if it comes up with an error, I'll have an if error around it. So I don't need the values, so there we go. So now it is adding, at the very beginning, it's adding 0, divided by 5 is 0, remainder 0, and adding 1 to it. And if that's an error, then it gives me the answer 1. Now, so what about all of that? Well, now I can just resize the table, and I will resize the table there. I will resize it to 1,000 rows, so I'll make that going all the way down to row number 4001. And so you can see it's now giving me all of this data. It's all randomized data. Right, before continuing, I'm just going to translate all of those into 15 different languages. So this first one is rand between, so that gives me a random number between, in this case, 1 and 10. And then I'm going to add together sum. What happens when you divide D1 by 5 and take the remainder? So that's the modulus, or the residual, as it's also known in English, so you can see residual. So add it together, and then if that becomes an error, then what I want is the number 1. Anyway, the idea of all of that is to give us this data. So what can we do then? Well, one thing we can do is create a pivot table. So I'll go to Insert and Pivot Table. Pivot tables allow you to easily arrange and summarize complex data. So click on Pivot Table. All of this is fine, just click OK. Now the next thing is, well, what question do I want it to answer? Well, let's say I want a list of the cheeses down here. I want the ranks going across, and I want to know how many of each type there were. So I'll drag name of cheese down to the rows, I'll drag rank across, and then I'll drag name of cheese into the values to count them. And so you can see that at the time of creating this completely random data, there were 83 people who said that cheese number 1 should be ranked first, and 82 people who said cheese number 1 should be ranked second. Now you can see cheese 10 is in the wrong order, so that's okay. I'll just go to the top and drag it down. There we go. Now maybe the question is, okay, how many were ranked first? And you can see the answer there, but maybe that's all they're interested in. Okay, so I'm going to change rank. I'm going to drag it into the photos and change my filter. I only want to see the first rank, number of times it was number 1. And then what I might also do is put a conditional formatting so I can see visually what's first and what's last. So you can see cheeses 4, 5 and 6 and 10, they were okay, but cheese 3, that was the real hit. So this is a quick way of analyzing data, complex data. Now you might also say, okay, but what was the percentage of that? Who liked what the best? Well, if we go into the value field settings and click on show values as, this is a tab that very few people seem to use. Show values as, and I'll change that to percentage of grand total and click OK. So you can see that with just a few clicks, we can see that cheese 3 was most highly valued by 12% of people, then cheese 7 and then cheese 8 and so forth. So this is one way of analyzing complex data. First of all, you get a table where each row contains all of the data you want. So one particular row is not dependent on another row. So for instance, you would have, if this was somebody's name, then you would have the same name for all of his choices and the same date. So you won't have to look